Along the same lines as already been mentioned, maybe more creativity in terms of the frameworks and methodological approaches that we're using. Aaron made mention of this idea around maybe looking at it from an economics focus or looking at it from an organizational behavior focus. And Andy talked about maybe some of the limited research that's been done with family or organization or small groups or teams. So how can we start to maybe expand out there and really try to touch in on some of those areas as well? And then I think finally, just a willingness to try to embrace some of these new ideas and interests. So wherever it is that maybe the industry is going, even though we don't necessarily want to follow always with what the industry is doing, but also to be kind of aware of what's happening out there and trying to do research that helps to reflect that.
Okay. I will start out by saying that I agree with Larry's argument in your essay that there's an inherent tension between the goals and interests of each disposition or area of study that makes up what we do, especially in terms of the goals of the sports media and society disposition and the professional sports communication disposition. That tension, I think, is manifest in the scholarship that we do, but also in overall trends and curriculum. Those tensions in some ways lead to silos. It is true that we need to be talking with each other, and I think moving our field or collective areas forward will in part be a function of how well we can resolve those silos. I'll start with kind of the disposition I see myself at least partly in, the sports media and society disposition, and the critique there is that the research is generally divorced from the practice of sports media. I myself feel unsatisfied sometimes at the end of working on a critical analysis. Mine and others like it oftentimes conclude with a statement about sports media professionals or other content creators needing to become more aware of the issues that we bring to light in our work. Yet, as we know, these issues continue to persist. The question then becomes, where is the change? If we agree with Larry's argument that the sports media and society disposition situates individuals as citizens, then it does become our axiological responsibility to create change in a way that leads to forms of social justice. And here I'm talking about the kind of critical cultural house within the media diversity and society disposition. That change, that activism, if you will, necessarily, however, requires engagement with the sport communication as profession side as well as the communication studies side to understand the structural and organizational realities inhibiting change. Critical analyses must take into account journalistic practices, for instance, in the goal of advocating and creating change. This, of course, means engagement with the industry to communicate what we do, which I think is a common theme up here. The new challenge, however, in that kind of engagement, as we call for it, is also a function of there's a new challenge that is a function of our symbiotic relationship with sports itself. As sports have grown, so have we. And our research interests. And so it raises questions then about the kinds of relationships we build through our institutions with sport organizations. And new tensions may emerge, particularly in terms of whose goals and interests are served as an outcome of that relationship and those new relationships. Finally, the question that continues to remain in my mind is who is listening to us outside of this room? Going back to my initial comments, I still strongly believe that we study a fluid, dynamic, and relevant area that speaks to other academic traditions and also, of course, to a vibrant sports industry in general. So our challenge moving forward is engaging what we do not only with those wider fields, but also with the public and the industry. We have to make it a goal to be in dialogue with various groups on what we study and think about creative ways to open those lines of communication and enact change in ways that are consistent with the goals of our own work in our own dispositions.
If I may, let me make just a brief response to some minor comments that they made, and then we'll open it up to questions. First, Andy really posed an us versus them issue. What does communication really bring unique in terms of making our case versus, say, people from the sociology of sport or other disciplines that would study communication or media relative to sport? I'm sorry, I don't think it's about an us versus them. In my experience, sports sociologists, policy people, historians sometimes. They know just as much about communication as us, okay? Communication as a field has really struggled with its uniqueness and making a case for its disciplinarity because it's had to. It had to justify its case in the academy. At the same time, let's be frank, it's an interdisciplinary endeavor that crosses all over the place that's relevant to virtually everything that's done with regard to studying human activity. There's some folks in sociology of sport that I know more about communication than people that studied it legitimately with a degree. Just because you studied it more doesn't mean you're better at it, okay? So that's not a nice thing to say, but it's true. Second, Ted's comment about stigma for the toy department, it didn't apply to him, and Ted was exceptional in his introduction by the person that said, well, he's not like all the others, but a lot of all the others are like that. They are the toy department, and there's some reason for that reputation, and the sport journalism profession is tied to the industry and the industry's well-being. You know, if sport is seen as a crappy place, sport journalists don't have a job. Okay, Ted also brought in the industry relevance issue. Yeah, and I guess we got to make it relevant to them, but I don't think that should be job one. I don't think really our job is to be lapdogs or unpaid research assistants for the sport industry or the media industry. Our job is to be researchers that have an eye out for the common good, for culture, for us improving our stake as human beings. And if that happens to align with the industry relevance or interest, well, great. But I would make an argument that more often than not, it doesn't. Thirdly, Marion mentioned public intellectualism, basically. He didn't put it that way, I don't believe, but I think that's something we all sometimes speak to, but we don't do a very good job of, and I think we need to focus on that and getting the word out about the relevance of our work, not just to industry, as I suggested, but to people, and they're thinking about the sometime inflated role of sport in society, and some of the problems that get raised by sport being such a heralded thing because it doesn't benefit us all in consistent ways. And finally, Erin brought up a really interesting point about silos. She's absolutely right. We're moving towards some, in a way, the dispositions are silos, I suppose. But doesn't it strike you that we're a little bit too small as a little interest area or field or whatever you want to call it to have silos at this point in time in our development? Rather, I think Erin brings up the notion of what we need to stress a whole lot more, and that's the intersections. If you think, I'm not sure I've gotten those dispositions right in terms of characterization. What do they say? It's they're not orthogonal, they're oblique, to use a factor analysis analogy, and there's bleed over, there's it's a messy state of affairs. But I think I've drawn some central tendencies in areas that are not speaking to each other enough. And I think that what that really makes an argument for is that we need to focus on those intersections a good deal more. So let me open it to questions. Hands up, and let us know who you're directing your questions to. Yes, Roxanne.
This is a question for pretty much everyone. Ted mentioned the politics that come into in the way when you want to create programs, right? This having some research too. So when Adam made his comment about
That would be you. Yeah, I do think, especially within that tenure system, but
hopefully, we're all developing 30, 35, 40-year careers, and for 6 years, you're limited with that. And then you've got a little bit more flexibility to do some things. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go completely lockstep, but I think for your own viability of the career, those first 6 years might be a bit more limiting as far as how you can reach out to the media and the type of projects you can do. You know, I do a lot of writing books now. I didn't write a single book before tenure. That was very much, hey, here's what they're looking for. It's blind peer-reviewed journal articles, and that's what I'll do. After that, you've got some freedom, and maybe part of that freedom can be what Marion's talking about here, with not just writing popular press books, but working more in that realm, contributing more, you know, interacting more with those outlets.
One thing would be basically, I know what Dr. Winter said, and I'm certainly not trying to go away from strong scholarship theoretically grounded, but I do think the research that most influenced me in the 1990s as a grad student at Texas, reading research articles saying, what am I doing here? And then I got the AAF, is that correct? Messner and Margaret Carlisle Duncan, where it was just the percentages of coverage for the Olympics, for ESPN, et cetera, the early studies, newspaper coverage. And it was something that anybody with, you know, consumer math background from high school could understand the statistics there. And these are as good a researchers as there's been in this field. And they laid that out. Now, obviously, Michael Messner has literally developed theories, okay, and goes deeply theoretical. But he wrote this report up through the AAF. They had a grant when people in sport media actually got some of those occasionally. But he did those reports. And similarly, I worked with Richard Labchek at UCF. Wonderful man. The next time he uses a theoretical framework will be the first time he uses a theoretical framework. Because what he does, he doesn't understand that. He's a PhD in political science. He goes out and gets the huge data that we all use that says, hey, 94% of sports columnists are men, 92% of editors, et cetera. And that is the stuff that when I talk about industry relevance could be there, and that gets you popular press on your research, and then you can do deep theoretical stuff for scholars and emerging scholars and doctoral students to see. So I think you can do both, but yeah, you usually get some credit if you have something cited in the New York Times, but it's still a lot less than an article in a Tier 2 journal in the tenure system, as ridiculous as that sounds. We can't change that. That's higher education, well above anybody's pay grade here, even you folks. Yeah.
Let me say real quickly, all right, not that all of this is about journalism, but let's go back to a core journalism principle. That notion of you either need to be first, be best, or be different. Folks, with a lot of the structures we have, we're likely not to be the first. If something happens today, we're not going to be the ones to move the needle there. In some cases, we aren't going to have access to the databases. We won't necessarily be the best, or at least be the best right away. We can be different. We can ask different questions. Some of the best interviews I've done have been when I'm not asking the same question to people for the 40th time. It's when, you talk to NBC's Dick Ebersol and you talk about race and how do you depict that in the Olympics, and he says, no one's ever asked me that. How in the world has no one ever asked him that?
Andy, repeat those priorities of journalism again. The first, what is it?
Be first, be best, be different.
Yeah. No, I think that's very nice. That's true. That's the pragmatics on the street for journalists. But let's back off that a little bit. What is the function of journalism in terms of a functioning democracy, health of a society, really about? Most journalists would reduce it to the simple sentence, to tell the truth as best we know it. Heard that before? I hope so. Because that's really our job too as scholars, not to be relevant to the industry. Like, as I said, if that happens to align, but to tell the truth as we know it about that relationship between sport and communication. We're seeing a rise, Jeff. I mentioned at the editorial board meeting. We're seeing a rise of interest, but it's slow because, in a way, people that are interested in, as I say, it's an imperfect or impossible modifier, non-mediated. because people that study interpersonal or group, there's still the shadow of media in those transactions between people. But with a venue and a place of legitimacy for work that is thusly focused, I think we will see a rise in scholars building careers around that intersection.
I would also add on the internationalization front, I missed the panel yesterday. There seems to be a missed opportunity that we're not doing more in the sport for development piece. That's taking some real traction in other tangential fields.
Yeah, sport for development is one of the really, really hot areas in the sociology of sport, applied sociology of sport, which is unusual for sociology of sport to use the modifier applied in front of it much lately in the last 20 years. I think you're absolutely right, because sport for development is really pro-social work. There are scholars like Brian Wilson at University of British Columbia who works in that area, who also worked in the area of communication. But it's a natural marriage between effective communication and moving public policy towards positive sport for development, and also programs such as are popular in Western Europe, sport for all kinds of programs, and facilitating that participation and engagement.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well, because I have a doctoral student who's graduated, but his interest is in sport for development. And I think one of the challenges that we have in other areas in terms of with organizations and trying to get in and collect data from them, that we were able to do that, we were able to overcome that challenge with the Sport for Development organization, because they only had 13 people that worked there. And so they said, we'd love for you to come in and analyze the way that we use social media and provide some insights for us on how to do this. And so it was an opportunity for us to look at it from an organizational perspective, to do a content analysis, also to interview some of those people and kind of marry sort of this different sets of information together. So I think that's a great idea.
Isn't it ironic that that industry, if you will, the sport for development industry, it's not an industry, it's a set of organizations that are facilitated by public policy ostensibly, allow access. But those organizations